If you've ever spent your entire life building something you hope to leave your children, listen carefully, because what happened to me didn't begin with a foreclosure notice. It began with a funeral. My name is Bennett. I'm 69 years old, a retired high school history teacher from Western Pennsylvania. For 42 years, my wife, Elaine, and I live in the same modest red brick house at the end of Maple Ridge Drive. We weren't wealthy. We never owned a vacation home or a luxury car. We simply paid our bills, looked after our neighbors, and believed that if you lived honestly, life would eventually return that kindness. I believed that until the afternoon I buried my wife. After the funeral, my son drove me back home. The driveway was blocked by a white moving truck. Two men were carrying my dining room table through the front door. I thought they had the wrong address. Then I noticed a bright pink SUV parked beside my mailbox. A woman stepped onto my porch wearing a tailored pink blazer, holding a clipboard as though she owned the place. She looked at me and smiled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett," she said calmly. "You can't come onto this property." For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking. "I've lived here since 1984. She didn't laugh. She simply handed me a folder. The property was legally transferred following an HOA foreclosure auction. What auction? She tilted her head as if speaking to a child. "The one you ignored." Those 6 words changed my life. My son grabbed the paperwork before I could. He flipped through the pages, then looked at me. "Dad, what is this?" I had no answer. According to the documents, I owed more than $14,000 in unpaid HOA dues, penalties, attorney fees, and court costs. The papers claimed I'd ignored certified letters for nearly 8 months. That wasn't possible. I paid every HOA bill the week it arrived. Every single one. The woman extended her hand. "My name is Deborah Pierce, president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association." Then she said something I'll never forget. "You should have read your mail." Behind her, strangers were wrapping my late wife's piano in moving blankets. That piano. Elaine had played it every Christmas for over 30 years. I started walking toward the porch. One of the movers stepped in front of me. "Sir, please don't make this difficult." Difficult? Everything I owned, everything my wife had touched, everything we'd spent 4 decades building, was being carried into someone else's truck. I felt my knees weaken. My son caught my arm before I hit the ground. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in a motel room looking at Elaine's wedding photograph. The frame had cracked during the move. I kept asking myself the same question. How do you lose a house you've already paid off? The next morning, my next-door neighbor, Russ Morgan, knocked on my motel room door. He looked nervous. "I've been trying to find you." He handed me a cardboard box. Inside were dozens of unopened envelopes. Every one of them had a yellow postal sticker. "Forwarding order on file." I frowned. I never filed a forwarding request. Russ slowly shook his head. "I know. I watched the mail carrier stop delivering to your box months ago." My stomach tightened. Someone had redirected my mail. Not one letter. All of it. County documents. Court filings. Everything. Someone had made sure I never saw a single warning. For the first time, I realized this might not have been a mistake. It might have been a plan. That afternoon, my son drove me to the county recorder's office. The young clerk searched my address. When she looked back up, her expression changed. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Bennett. The foreclosure has already been recorded." She printed nearly 70 pages of legal documents. Every page looked official. Every signature had been notarized. One date. That should never have existed. Martin Doyle didn't say another word. He simply slid the document across the table. "Look at the date." I frowned. The paper was a notarized affidavit stating that the HOA board had unanimously approved foreclosure proceedings against my property. The meeting date read, February 29th, 2025. I stared at it for several seconds. Then Martin quietly opened his desk calendar. "Harold, there wasn't a February 29th in 2025. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It was such a small mistake. Yet it shouldn't have existed. Someone had created the document later and forgotten one simple fact. Martin leaned back in his chair. Fraud isn't usually uncovered because criminals are careless. It's uncovered because they eventually become overconfident. That tiny date gave Martin enough reason to request every original HOA record from the county and subpoena Maple Ridge's internal files. 3 days later, someone broke into Martin's office. Nothing expensive was missing. The computers were untouched. The television was still hanging on the wall. Only one thing had disappeared: my file. Every copy of the foreclosure documents. Every note Martin had made. Every photograph. Gone. When the police officer finished taking the report, Martin looked at me and said something that made the hair on my neck stand up. "They're scared." I asked, "Scared of what?" He answered quietly, "Scared of whatever we haven't discovered yet." The next morning, an elderly woman walked into Martin's office carrying a faded cardboard box. She introduced herself as Judith Keller. I was secretary of the HOA for almost 12 years. She placed the box on the conference table. "I've been watching the news." Then she looked directly at me. "I think these belong to you." Inside were handwritten notebooks, old attendance sheets, meeting agendas, original voting records. Judith explained that she never trusted electronic records completely. Every deadline appeared to have passed months earlier. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I would have believed every word. Then something caught my eye. A green certified mail receipt. Someone had signed my name. Except, it wasn't my handwriting. Not even close. I showed it to the clerk. She compared my driver's license. Then the receipt. Her eyes narrowed. "That doesn't look right." It was the first hopeful sentence I'd heard since Elaine's funeral. She quietly leaned closer. "Off the record, I've worked here 11 years. I've seen forged signatures before." My pulse quickened. "You think this was forged?" She glanced toward her supervisor's office before answering. "I didn't say that. But if I were you, I'd hire a very good attorney." By sunset, I was sitting across from Martin Doyle, a 65-year-old lawyer who had spent most of his career fighting property disputes. He listened without interrupting. He never once looked at his watch. When I finished, he asked only one question. "Mr. Bennett, did your wife handle the household paperwork?" I nodded. "Always." Martin sighed. "So whoever did this picked the worst possible time." His words hit me harder than anything Deborah had said. Elaine had been gone for only 6 days. Someone hadn't simply stolen my house. They had waited until the one person who organized every bill, every receipt, every record, was no longer here to defend it. Martin spread every document across his conference table. For nearly 20 minutes, he said nothing. Finally, he reached for a single page buried near the bottom of the stack. His face changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. He read it again, then a third time. Slowly, he looked up at me. "Harold, I think I know why they believed they'd never get caught." I leaned forward. "What did you find?" Martin slid the paper across the desk. I looked down. It appeared completely ordinary, until I noticed one tiny detail. A date. Every meeting, she made handwritten notes before typing the official minutes. I kept them because my late husband always said, "Paper remembers what people try to forget." Martin carefully opened the notebook from the month my foreclosure had supposedly been approved. He turned one page, then another. Finally, he stopped. There was my address. The board discussion lasted less than 5 minutes. According to Judith's handwritten notes, there had never been a vote to foreclose on my home. Instead, the board had voted 5-1 to give me 90 additional days because of Elaine's declining health. I felt my throat tighten. Elaine had been receiving chemotherapy that winter. The board had shown compassion. Someone erased it. Martin smiled for the first time. They didn't just forge one document. They rewrote history. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity 2 weeks later. Neighbors filled every seat. Several local reporters stood along the back wall. Judge Eleanor Marsh entered precisely at 9 o'clock. Deborah Pierce looked confident. She wore the same bright pink blazer I'd seen the day she threw me out of my own home. She never once looked in my direction. Martin called Judith Keller as his first witness. She calmly described how every meeting had been recorded by hand before official minutes were typed. Then she handed the judge the original notebook. Judge Marsh spent nearly 10 minutes comparing Judith's handwritten notes with the documents Deborah had filed with the county. The silence inside the courtroom became almost unbearable. Finally, the judge looked toward Deborah. "Mrs. Pierce, would you please explain why these two records tell completely different stories?" Deborah's attorney stood immediately. "Objection." Judge Marsh never took her eyes off Deborah. Overruled. Martin then displayed enlarged copies of both documents on courtroom monitors. The differences were impossible to ignore. Entire paragraphs had been added. Names had been changed. Votes had been altered. Even signatures appeared in different places. Then came the moment no one expected. Martin asked permission to play security footage from the county records office. The video showed Deborah entering the building after business hours with a temporary access badge issued for document corrections. She wasn't alone. Standing beside her was the registered owner of the investment company that had purchased my house. The courtroom erupted. Judge Marsh struck her gavel. Order. Martin wasn't finished. He handed the judge bank records showing that, less than 48 hours after the auction, money from that investment company had been transferred into an account owned by Deborah's husband. The room fell completely silent. Judge Marsh slowly removed her glasses. Mrs. Pierce, this court has seen enough. She immediately declared the foreclosure void. Every recorded transfer was canceled. Ownership of my home was legally restored. Then she did something I never expected. She ordered the county clerk to notify the district attorney before anyone left the courthouse. Within minutes, 2 investigators entered the courtroom. They walked directly to Deborah. One investigator spoke quietly. Mrs. Pierce, we'd like you to come with us regarding an ongoing fraud investigation. For the first time, the woman who had smiled while strangers carried my wife's piano away looked frightened. 6 months later, our home was exactly as Elaine had left it. Her piano stood beside the front window. Her favorite quilt rested across the couch. Every evening, I still found myself looking toward the kitchen, almost expecting to hear her humming while dinner cooked. Grief never completely leaves you, but neither does justice. State investigators later uncovered evidence that several elderly homeowners had been targeted using nearly identical forged records. Some recovered their homes. Others received compensation after years of believing they had simply lost everything. As for me, people sometimes ask what saved my house. They expect me to say it was my lawyer, or the judge, or the investigators. They're all wrong. What saved my home was one elderly woman who refused to throw away an old notebook because her husband once told her. Paper remembers what people try to forget. One forgotten notebook destroyed an entire lie. And when the truth finally reached the courtroom, it didn't just give me back my house. It gave my late wife's memory the justice she deserved.